Hello everyone and welcome to the historynetwork.org podcast. And thanks to a couple of patrons who have signed up recently, Rodney Bradley and Liam Bantock. Thank you so much. Just a quick reminder, if this is the first time you're hearing about our Patreon campaign, what we want to do is launch our podcast via Patreon in 2019 from season 26 onwards, and we'd like you to sign up as a patron at www.patreon.com/The History Network. And if you go to that specific address, you will find out about what it is we're looking to do and the benefits of becoming a patron. So we'd really appreciate you taking a look at that. But in the meantime, let's kick on with the penultimate episode of the season. The historynetwork.org podcast, season 25, episode 9, Operation Longcloth. This episode was written by Paul Seaman. Paul studied medieval and modern history at the Royal Holloway University in London, then went into teaching, completing several postgraduate qualifications, including a master's. He is now a primary national leader of education based in Norfolk, UK. He spends his time between work, family, and indulging his passion for military history, primarily through wargaming with the New Buckingham Historical Wargamers. Following the surprise attack on Pearl Harbour in December 1941, Japanese forces simultaneously invaded British Malaya, Hong Kong, and the Philippines. Japanese troops took just 70 days to crush the British Empire forces in Malaya and Singapore, which was surrendered on the 15th of February 1942. By the end of March, the Japanese had conquered Malaya, the Netherlands, East Indies, as well as many of the smaller islands around Papua New Guinea, leaving Allied forces in full retreat in the Philippines, New Guinea and Burma. Morale was rock bottom, and the Japanese seemed invincible. By the end of May, the Japanese had conquered most of Burma, halting at the Chindwin and the Salween rivers as the monsoon rains approached. This proved to be as far as the Japanese intended to go at that point, as other campaigns, such as the battles in the Solomons and New Guinea, took precedence. Neither, though, were the Allies in a position to counter-attack. British and Commonwealth troops were heavily embroiled in the North Africa and Middle East campaigns. A Germany's first policy was held in London, while America, reeling from Pearl Harbour, was still mustering its forces, fighting on Guadalcanal and contributing to the North African campaign through Operation Torch. Nevertheless, the British sought to mount two campaigns across the dry season of 1942-43. The first was a small and ultimately unsuccessful attempt by the Indian Eastern Army to reoccupy the Mayo Peninsula and the airfield on Akiab Island, while the second was the unconventional and controversial Operation Longcloth, staged by the newly formed 77th Indian Infantry Brigade under the leadership of their eccentric and unorthodox commander, Colonel Ord Wingate. They would become known as the Chindits. Wingate was born in India on 26th of February 1903, but soon moved back to England, where he attended Charterhouse School as a day boy before he was accepted into the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich. Wingate's unique personality and single-minded determination were soon evident. In his first year, he was subjected to a ragging ritual named running, as a result of returning a horse too late to the stable. This ritual consisted of the first year being stripped and forced to run a gauntlet of senior students, all of whom wielded a knotted towel, which was used to hit the accused on his journey along the line. On reaching the end, the first year would then be thrown into an icy cold cistern of water. When it came time for Wingate to run the gauntlet, He walked up to the senior student at the head of the line, stared at him and dared him to strike. The senior refused. Wingate moved to the next senior and did the same. He too refused. In turn, each senior declined to strike. Coming to the end of the line, Wingate walked to the cistern and dived straight into the icy cold water. Having gained an interest in the affairs of the Middle East from his father, who had been firstly Governor-General of the Sudan and then High Commissioner of Egypt between 1899 and 1919, Wingate had cycled through Europe in order to join the Sudan Defence Force in 1927. There he instigated ambushes of slave traders and ivory poachers, which was a marked change from the previous tactic of regular patrolling. But while he was well respected by his men, he antagonized his superiors with his belligerent and uncompromising personality. After his stint in the Sudan and some time in England, Wingate was assigned to Palestine as an intelligence officer. Here, Palestinian Arab guerrillas had undertaken a campaign of attacks against British mandate officials and Jewish communities. Using his experiences in the Sudan, Wingate formulated the idea of British-led Jewish commandos, armed with grenades and light arms, to help quell the Arab revolt. He took his idea in person to Lieutenant General Wavell, the commanding officer of British forces in Palestine and Transjordan. Wavell approved the initiative, and after convincing the Jewish leadership of the Haganah, the Jewish armed group, Wingate formed the Special Night Squads in June 1938. The sometimes brutal tactics used by these squads were still effective in quelling the rebellion, and Wingate received the Distinguished Service Order at the end of 1938. However, his aggressive personality, coupled with outspoken views on the formation of a Jewish state, caused him to be relieved of his command soon after. After some time back in England at the outbreak of war in 1939, Wingate was summoned back to the Sudan by the now full General Wavell, who had left Palestine before Wingate had been removed of his command, but had since been named Commander-in-Chief of the Middle East Command. Wavell was keen for Wingate to begin operations against the Italian occupying forces in neighbouring Ethiopia. Here Wingate established Gideon Force, named after the biblical judge who had defeated a large army with a small force of men. Gideon Force was composed of British, Sudanese and Ethiopian soldiers, as well as a number of Haganah former Special Night Squad volunteers who had been invited over from Palestine by Wingate himself. Wingate was temporarily promoted to Lieutenant Colonel, put in command of Gideon Force, and was instrumental in the eventual defeat of the Italians. The 1,700 men of Gideon Force accepted the surrender of 20,000 Italians in early 1941, and Wingate was one of the men who accompanied Emperor Haile Selassie on his return to Addis Ababa that May. Wingate was mentioned in dispatches and received his second DSO as a result. Nevertheless, Wingate was again soon highly critical of his superiors. His rank had been reduced to major at the end of the East African campaign. He felt his achievements had been belittled and his men had been ignored. Already somewhat depressed, Wingate contracted malaria, and a side effect of the drug he was given to treat this caused this depression to deepen, resulting in a failed suicide attempt. Word reached Wavell, who was now Commander-in-Chief in India commanding the Southeast Asian Theatre, who brought Wingate to Rangoon in late February 1942 and immediately promoted him to Colonel. Having seen the success of Wingate's ideas firstly in Palestine and then in Ethiopia, and with very limited resources himself with which to fight against the Japanese, Wavell soon ordered Wingate to organise guerrilla units to fight behind Japanese lines. The first unit formed under Wingate's command was the 77th Indian Infantry Brigade. Soon the unit became known as the Chindits, a corruption of the Burmese mythical lion, Chinte, which guarded, albeit in statue form, Buddhist temples. Around half of the Chindits were British from the 13th Battalion, King's Liverpool Regiment, or from the newly formed 142 Commando, derived from the Bush Warfare School in Burma at Mae Meo. The other half came from the newly formed 3rd Battalion, 2nd Gurkha Rifles, and Burmese troops from 2nd Battalion, the Burma Rifles. Wingate established a training base in central India and attempted to make his men resilient to the conditions they would face by having them camp out in the Indian jungle during the rainy season. This proved catastrophic, and disease and illness ran through the unit, and hundreds of men were unable to train. Many of the men were replaced in September 1942 by recruits from elsewhere in the army. Formulating his ideas into the concept of long-range penetration, Wingate trained his troops to be able to march on foot through Japanese lines deep into the interior behind. They would be supplied by aircraft supply drops, and would rely on close air support in lieu of heavy artillery. Their aim was to disrupt enemy lines of supply and communication, stage ambushes, and divert Japanese troops in order to support a larger British offensive. As such, the Chindits departed from the traditional brigade and battalion organisational structures and were instead grouped into 8 columns, although one of these was later disbanded to bring the others up to strength. Each of these contained an infantry rifle company with 9 Bren light machine guns and 3 2-inch mortars, a support group with the heavy weapons, 4 Boys anti-tank rifles, 2 medium Vickers machine guns and 2 light anti-aircraft guns, a reconnaissance platoon from the Burma Rifles, and a sabotage group from 142 Commando Company. Small radio-equipped detachments from the RAF, signals and medics were attached to the column headquarters. The heavy weapons, radios, reserve ammunition, rations and other stores were carried on mules, which would also provide an emergency source of food once their loads had been depleted. With 57 mule handlers, each British column numbered 306 men. The Gurkha columns were slightly stronger, with 369 men. Each column was designed to be large enough to inflict a heavy blow on the enemy, but small enough to evade action if necessary. Each man carried more than 72 pounds, 33 kilos, of equipment, which was proportionally more than the mules carrying the support weapons and other stores. This included a personal weapon such as a Lee Enfield rifle or Sten gun, ammunition, grenades, a machete or Gurkha kukri knife, 7 days' rations, ground sheet, change of uniform and other assorted items. Much of this load was carried in an Everest carrier, which was essentially a metal rucksack frame without a pack. Wavell, now a field marshal, had originally intended the Chindit operation to be part of a larger British, American, Chinese offensive, but now, with supplies and shipping insufficient and being diverted elsewhere, this had to be cancelled. Wingate petitioned Wavell to still let the Chindits go. He argued that he would be able to evaluate his theories of long-range penetration, give his men valuable experience of jungle operations, test the Japanese and disrupt any of their planned offensives. In private, Wingate was also concerned that his growing opponents in the British Army would rob him of any further opportunities to test his theories. After some consideration, Field Marshal Wavell approved the plans and sent the Chindits into Burma. On the 8th of February 1943, Operation Longcloth began, and 3,000 Chindit troops, split into 2 groups and with Wingate with them, began their march into Burma. In a moving gesture, Wavell saluted them on their way. The brigade would cross the Chindwin and Japanese lines in an area to the southeast of Imphal before marching up to 200 miles towards Indore. Its main objective was the north-south railway through Burma, an important logistical resource for the Japanese. The brigade started from Tamu on the front line. Wingate issued his order of the day, beginning, "Today we stand on the threshold of battle," and concluding, Let us pray that God may accept our services and direct our endeavours, so that when we have done all, we shall see the fruits of our labours and be satisfied. Operation Longcloth began with an ingenious deception. Whilst the main thrust was aimed at Indore, to the due east of Imphal, 2 columns, nearly 1,000 men and a third of the Chindit force, crossed the Chindwin, but moved south, and the following day took an airdrop of supplies in broad daylight. Burma Rifles intelligence had identified that there were several pro-Japanese villages locally, and a Chindit officer dressed up as a brigadier and making sure his soldiers were well heard by all around, ordered substantial airdrops at various points due south. This deception successfully distracted the Japanese and enabled the remaining 5 columns to move forward during the night of the 14th of February, completely undetected. Burma was the land of extremes. Beautiful architecture and scenery were abundant, yet northern and central Burma was no tropical paradise. Mountain ranges were thick with seemingly impenetrable jungles. The rainforests were trackless, steep regions filled with vines and rotting vegetation, this alternating with sharp elephant grass as tall as a man, or with thick bamboo thickets, could obscure visibility to only a few metres. Summer humidity reached up to 46 centigrade or 115 Fahrenheit in the central plains, and during the monsoon, which lasted half a year, pack animals became the only reliable form of transport in the narrow jungle trails and through the mud. The Japanese were not the Chindits' only enemy. Torrential rain produced a sea of sometimes liquid mud and permanently sodden clothes. Dense thickets of brush and foliage slashed at men and animals. Clothing, boots and skin rotted from continued exposure to the humid atmosphere, and soon casualties from tropical and parasitic diseases were reported. To this were added swarms of leeches, clouds of mosquitoes which appeared regardless of the time, poisonous snakes, flukes, ticks and flies. Open wounds were to be quickly covered or risk viral infections. Many of the Chindits quickly learned that wearing beards like Wingate mitigated the need for a shaving kit, formed the best natural camouflage for the face, and more importantly, kept out mosquitoes and ticks. The Chindit columns, each an independent fighting unit, had their own individual stories to tell over the coming weeks. Both groups had taken part in skirmishes with the Japanese by the end of February, but soon things began to unravel for Wingate. Before even reaching the railway, 2 column, one of the 2 columns to have taken part in the initial deception and part of the southern group, was ambushed by a strong Japanese force after brazenly marching down the railway and bivouacking near the track. No sooner had they moved out of the bivouac that the Japanese ambush began. The CO, Major Burnett, also changed rendezvous instructions partway through the action, and as a result the column broke up, failed to meet at the rendezvous and ceased to exist as a fighting unit, the men splitting up and attempting to find their way back to India. 4 column, under new command following the replacement of Major Conron just a few days earlier, were also ambushed at the start of March and forced to retreat to the Chindwin. To exacerbate his problems, Wingate had also lost contact with Major Dunlop's 1 column, part of the southern group, so was left with just 3, 5, 7 and 8 columns to complete his objective. Establishing his HQ south of Pin Bon, Wingate prepared his plan for the main Chindit attack on the railway. 7 column under Major Wilkes and 8 column under Major Scott went north to attack Pindabu in order to draw Japanese forces to that area and to prevent Japanese reinforcements coming south towards the railway at Nankan and Bonchaung, where the main demolitions were planned. There the railway crossed 2 bridges and snaked across a precarious ledge through Bonchaung Gorge. The plan was to blow the 2 bridges and stage another massive explosion at the gorge. The attack on the railway itself was given to 3 and 5 columns. 5 Column was under the command of Major Bernard Ferguson, who would later be made a life peer and serve as Governor-General of New Zealand in the 1960s, while 3 Column was commanded by Major Mad Mike Calvert, later to serve with the SAS, and who, like Wingate, would have his own brushes with the military top brass in his time. Nevertheless, he was also a very capable commander and had led the bush warfare school in Burma before the invasion. 3 Column rested near Nankan in order to coordinate timings with 5 Column's attack on Bon Chaung Gorge, and in doing so discovered a major Japanese unit at Wunto to the south of their position. Calvert ordered an RAF bombing attack on their location to coincide with the attacks on Nankan and Bon Chaung. On the 6th of March he established roadblocks to the north and south of the village, set his rendezvous to the southeast of the village, while the rest of the column was split into 2 demolition teams with the aim of blowing 2 large bridges either side of Nankan Station. At 12:45 the groups moved off, laying mines and booby traps, and all went smoothly until 13:15, when 2 truckloads of Japanese troops obliviously blundered into the northern road block. The Gurkhas manning the roadblock inflicted heavy casualties on the Japanese, but soon reinforcements arrived and the Gurkhas were outnumbered. The rest of the column sent men to reinforce the roadblock, while Calvert and the demolition teams frantically worked to complete the demolitions under heavy Japanese fire. Calvert soon managed to return to his command post, resighted the 3-inch mortar, and with not inconsiderable luck dropped the first round straight on the Japanese truck, which promptly exploded, causing the remaining Japanese to flee. Both bridges were soon blown and a long stretch of railway destroyed. Calvert organised a roll call and discovered the column had not sustained a single casualty. It was his 30th birthday, and for this action he was awarded the DSO. Ferguson and 5 Column had also been successful in their objective at Bon Chaung Gorge, where another bridge was blown and a massive explosion heard by 3 Column 10 miles away brought down hundreds of tons of rock and earth onto the railway line. However, his column had suffered casualties in a clash with the Japanese. Following the completion of his mission to disrupt the railway line, Wingate now had important decisions to make. The success of the attack by 3 and 5 Columns had fully alerted the Japanese to the presence of the Chindits, and with no supporting main offensive to divert resources, they were now to be hunted by large numbers of Japanese troops. They had 2 options: return from whence they came with Japanese forces looking to cut them off, or proceed east across the Irrawaddy River. Following discussion with column commanders, it was agreed that the columns would head east and cross the Irrawaddy. Over the next week or 2 the columns set off to cross the river. The Japanese were in hot pursuit, but by the 15th of March all columns were across the bank, with varying degrees of luck and success. Calvert's luck not leaving him, as a group of Burmese fishing boats appeared as 3 Column were preparing to cross, which they promptly commandeered. Over the next week the columns gathered intelligence and laid ambushes, whilst 3 Column was sent south towards the Gokteik Viaduct. However, on the 22nd of March, Wingate received orders from 4th Corps HQ to bring his whole force back to India. This was due to the increasing distance the RAF was having to resupply the columns by air, and with the Chindit forces so scattered. Wingate made a broad plan to return, but in reality, although they were to leave their heavy equipment and kill the mules, it was largely up to the column commanders to decide how best to get their own men home. By now the Chindits were tired and short of food. Many were exhausted or sick and faced a dangerous journey home, pursued by the Japanese. Many were ambushed and captured by the waiting enemy. 7 Column chose to head into China, arriving in mid-April to a very appreciative welcome by the Chinese. 8 Column built a runway in a jungle clearing and evacuated their wounded by air. The rest returned by recrossing the Irrawaddy and Chindwin rivers, either as a column or split into smaller groups to avoid the Japanese. One column received a supply drop of rubber dinghies and lifebelts to assist with the river crossing. Some of the columns had now lost their radio equipment and were unable to call for supply, but some of these units were fortunately located by reconnaissance aircraft and received supplies as a result. However, for many this was to be their final journey. Countless small dispersal groups were seen heading off into the jungle and were never heard from again. Throughout the whole operation, those too sick or wounded to walk had been left behind out of necessity, and in many cases it really was now each man or group of men for themselves. Over the next weeks and months, men began to trickle back across the Chindwin to India. By the end of April, after a 3-month mission, most surviving Chindits had returned, having marched between 750 and 1,000 miles. Of the 3,000 men that had begun the operation, a third, 818, had been killed, taken prisoner, or died of disease, and of the 2,182 men who returned, about 600 were too debilitated from their wounds or disease to return to active service. Operationally, this first Chindit campaign had hardly been a resounding success. Of course, the railway had been taken out of action, but the Japanese had it back in operation within a mere 4 weeks. A casualty rate of 30 to 50% was a massive price to pay. However, the legacy of Operation Longcloth was far more wide-reaching than a railway line. The press held it up as a resounding success, and Wingate and the Chindits were used to tremendous propaganda effect. They had single-handedly managed to dispel the myth that the Japanese soldier in the jungle was an invincible foe, and proved that British and Allied soldiers could more than hold their own. Despite the heavy casualties suffered by the Chindit columns, Wingate, in typical style, considered that his visionary concept of long-range penetration had been fully vindicated. Wingate's plans for a second Chindit campaign, named Operation Thursday, caught the imagination of Churchill, who ensured that he got more than he wanted for his much larger expedition. 6 brigades, including a refitted 77 Brigade, were trained as Chindits, and they were given a private air force, the American No. 1 Air Commando, with gliders for assault landings, C-47 transports to airlift in the main force, light planes for casualty evacuation, and a force of Mustang fighter bombers and B-25 bombers trained in ultra-close air support. Ironically, Thursday saw the Chindits operate behind Japanese lines as the enemy attacked Imphal and Kohima, a decision taken by the Japanese directly as a result of Operation Longcloth in order to provide more defence against Allied incursions, but one that they would live to regret. In this operation, Chindits were to establish semi-permanent fortified bases in the jungle, a tactic not dissimilar to those used by the Americans and French in Vietnam, and even more recently in Afghanistan. Unfortunately, Wingate would not live to see the end of this larger operation, being killed in an aircraft crash in 1944. Without his vision, the Chindits were soon employed as more conventional troops in roles they were not really well suited to. As a consequence, there has been much debate as to the actual effectiveness of the Chindit operations, but in that they diverted substantial Japanese forces from other operations to deal with them, caused a rethink in the Japanese strategy in Burma, increased morale, and destroyed the myth of the invincible Japanese soldier, and influenced unconventional and special forces from Merrill's Marauders to the SAS, and mirroring tactics employed even to the present day, there can be no doubt that for an operation which knocked out a railway line for 4 weeks at the cost of over 1,000 men, Longcloth created a legacy all of its own. Do remember to go to patreon.com/The History Network and find out what Angus and I are thinking of as an approach for season 26 onwards. You've been listening to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast, written by Paul Seaman, read by Nick Barker.